thank you for joining us for this special event on the death penalty and the many moral and legal concerns it raises. I'm Allison McKinney-Tim, founder and executive director of Justice Revival. We're a Christian voice for human rights in the United States, and I'll be your host for today's conversation, part of our ongoing series, The Heart of Human Rights. This month, April 2022, is a rare occasion when religious seasons of Passover, Easter, and Ramadan converge. And people of faith everywhere are praying, observing, reflecting, celebrating. Also this month, however, 4 executions are scheduled here in the United States starting tomorrow. Each of these cases highlights troubling aspects of capital punishment, this irreversible form of retributive justice. Today, we'll be talking about why this persists in America long after it's been eradicated elsewhere. We'll discuss who's most vulnerable to execution in our society and what we can all do to take action in response. We'll also look at what the wisdom of the Christian faith, a religion that arose in the wake of state-sanctioned killing, what it has to say to us today. Joining me today to discuss all of this and more are 2 extraordinary faith leaders and resolute advocates who are on the front lines of the struggle to abolish capital punishment in the United States. Sister Helen Prejean, CSJ, is known around the world for her tireless work against the death penalty. She sparked national dialogue on capital punishment and spurred the Catholic Church's vigorous opposition currently to all executions. Her seminal book, Dead Man Walking, an eyewitness account of the death penalty in the United States, it inspired an Academy Award-winning movie, a play, and an opera. Sister Helen's most recent book, River of Fire, My Spiritual Journey, is a compelling memoir about her rise to become a powerful voice of influence and of justice in the church. And Shane Claiborne is a prominent speaker, activist, and best-selling author. He heads up Red Letter Christians, a movement of folks committed to living as if Jesus meant the things he said. Shane is a champion for grace, which has led him to actually go to jail because of his advocacy for the homeless, and to travel to places like Iraq and Afghanistan to stand against war. Today, grace fuels his passion to end the death penalty and to stop gun violence. Also a prolific author, Shane has written many books, including Executing Grace, How the Death Penalty Killed Jesus and Why It's Killing Us, which offers a powerful appeal for abolition of the death penalty. Welcome again, Shane and Sister Helen. It is great to have you with us.
Good to be here. Really
So
good.
And I want to start by asking each of you to tell us something about your personal journey. If you could, what was kind of the moment or maybe the season or event in your life that galvanized you to become a lifelong advocate for abolishing the death penalty? Sister Helen, maybe you could start us off with a bit of your story.
Sure. I'll just go into the simple kernel of the whole thing was awakening to the gospel of Jesus, that it was about justice and not just being charitable to people around you. I was a good nun, very pious. I prayed for people, prayed for all the poor people in the world, and charitable to people around me, which was a small lagoon of people, mostly in a white suburban neighborhood. But the awakening to justice, it was a moment of grace. It was a talk I heard that about the gospel, and the core line that changed the spiritual trajectory of my life was Jesus preached good news to the poor. I thought What that meant was how loved they were by God. Every hair of their head was numbered. One day they'd have a great reward and sit at the banquet table right next to Jesus in the heavenly kingdom. But it had nothing to do with working for justice and seeking those rights that were rightfully theirs. And I heard that line, and I heard then what followed it, integral to the good news to people who are poor, is that's not God's will for them to simply passively endure it, but they have a right to strive for what is rightfully theirs. And I realized how passive I'd been, and that ignited me, and I moved in among poor and struggling, yet resilient African-American people in New Orleans. They became my teacher, and that led me straight to death row, because in that environment at Hope House, among African-American community, I got an invitation to write a man on death row. Thought I was only going to be writing letters. You got to watch out. We want to add sneaky Jesus into this whole thing that we're talking about. Because I thought I was only going to be writing letters. We hadn't had an execution in 20 years in the early 80s. I ended up being in the execution chamber and witnessing the electrocution of this man. And that's it. Once I witnessed it, that's the fire, the image of the fire in the memoir I wrote, River of Fire. And then it's been that ever after. Once you become a witness to something and the rest of the community isn't awake yet, your job is to be a witness and to go in love out to the community to wake up people, believing that their hearts are good and that they just have to wake up. And that, in short, is my story.
Wow. And you've awakened so many, I know, over the decades of your work. And as you talked about moving in to live among the poor, I sense a parallel with Shane's story. I know you have a story, a similar one in that theme in Philadelphia. Shane, what led you to be so passionate about ending the death penalty?
Well, this is going to be just a lovely conversation because there's a lot of parallels. You know, I fell in love with Jesus when I was really young down here in Tennessee in the Bible Belt. And y'all didn't get to see this that you're tuning in now. I showed Sister Helen and Alice, and I got my signed picture of Dolly Parton that says, "To Shane, love Dolly." And this is where I grew up in the Tennessee hills. And that, you know, that shaped who I am spiritually, but it also shaped some of my ideas around political things and social issues. We talked a lot growing up about being pro-life, but I began to see that we had really narrowly defined what that meant. And we were pro-life on abortion, but on many other issues, we were on the wrong side of life. And I began to really want to be more consistent with that ethic for life, with the conviction that every person is made in the image of God. And so I went back and I started to look at some of the scriptures that I had used to defend the death penalty. And I think this is really important for folks that are tuning in, that I spent a lot of my life arguing in support of the death penalty, even using the Bible, you know, the eye for an eye, Romans 13, different verses that I think really legitimated the death penalty. And I went back and took a closer look at those. My love for Jesus really leads me to believe that every person is more than the worst thing that they've done, as Brian Stevenson says so often, and that we're also no one's beyond redemption. That's at the heart of the gospel. So I'm in Tennessee right now, even though I've lived in Philly for the last 20 years, because we've been vigiling and praying and protesting the two executions scheduled for tomorrow, one here in Tennessee and one in Texas. So that's, you know, heavy on our hearts. We marched with these shirts, Sister Helen. I don't know if you saw them, but they have Jesus, you know, in the the electric chair, and on the back it says, "I can't imagine God saying that we should have executed more people, but I can imagine God saying, 'Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy.'" Okay. So, you know, that's a little bit of my story. But, you know, the other thing that I heard in Sister Helen say that's been so important to me is proximity makes all the difference in the world. And after I wrote my first book, I started, I always gave my books away to folks that are incarcerated. It never made sense to me to try to charge them money. So I always gave them away. But that meant that I began to write letters back and forth with folks that are on death row, and eventually began to visit them. And many of the guys here in Tennessee, I've gotten to know for 10 years. And so when this is not just an issue, but it has names and faces, that really makes all the difference in the world. So that's still what fuels the fire in my bones, just as it does for Sister Helen, is knowing people that have been impacted by this.
You know what I love already, Shane, about you? You are talking about, it's a huge, huge issue, and everything in a lot of ways is aligned against us in a society that embraces violence on so many levels. But there's joy inside you.
Yes.
There's life and energy inside you. I mean, it is like hope alive inside you because you're engaged. I mean, hope is an active verb. And when we are engaged, that life can flow through us. And so everybody listening to this and part of this today, the more we get engaged and get our boats in the current of human rights in this, we come alive in a way. We meet a great community of people that we're aligned with. I just want to say that in response to your first little salvo out there, holding up Dolly Parton, no less. And we're off. Let's talk.
And you mentioned, Sister Helen, that we're in a culture that it glorifies violence and it feeds on violence. And I'm struck by how the United States, on so many issues, tends to be an outlier, we know, on human rights. So there has been this global movement since the mid-20th century to eradicate the death penalty or to place a moratorium on its use. We know most countries have done that, over 140, and there are treaties, international human rights law treaties to end the death penalty, but the US does not participate. Even until relatively recently, it's still executed defendants charged with the crime committed as a minor in violation of those international norms. Why is this country still putting its own citizens to death?
So let's descend into Christianity and the way it's lived in this country. I just read we just celebrated Passover, Easter, Ramadan. And there was an article of a person angry at God. What's in the story of the Passover? That God kills all the firstborn, Egyptians and animals. I mean, the cows, the rabbits, everybody got it. This is God punishing. And God, when we open up that Bible is filled with conflicting messages. Adam and Eve sinned, they're punished. Punishment. It's throughout the Bible. The book of Revelations is filled with violence. Jesus is coming back and he is mad as hell with a sword in his mouth and throwing people, the unawakened, the sinners, into a burning pit. So we got to deal with that. And there's a double image of God that's been presented throughout the scriptures. And we can quote all the mercy passages we want, and then we can be hit with all these passages of violence. How is Christianity being lived in our country? And so you have the white supremacist Jesus. You got the John Wayne Jesus. Have y'all read that book, Jesus and John Wayne?
Oh, yes.
You send John Wayne in and get the job done. And they'd be quoting that Exodus story. This is what God did. So we have all this conflicting stuff. And then we also have religion as a very privatized thing. Jesus and me, Jesus saves me, and I get to heaven by following Jesus. And justice isn't part of that. And for a long time, that was my own life. And so we have to really open up that Jesus that goes among the poor and the liberation of poor people and the struggling for justice, and that mercy champions, pain for pain and the forgiving of enemy. How do we make that live? There was a terrible statistic in the mid-'80s. My first execution was 1984, Patrick Saunier. And I joined the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And by 1986, there was a poll done. And it showed that the more people went to church, the more they believed in the death penalty. Now we got to crack that open. What's going on there between the privatized religion and that misinterpretation of the crucifixion of Jesus. We got a lot to unpack. So take it, Shane.
Wow.
And
And I
Shane,
know,
go answer this for us. Shane is going to break all this open for us and help us understand.
Oh, Lord.
I know you've written, Shane, that the death penalty persists in our country, not despite Christians, but because of Christians. Such a powerful statement. And this was backed up by this recent Pew study in 2021 that showed white Protestants have the highest approval rate of the death penalty at nearly 3/4 for all white Protestants. It was about 60% overall for all adults. And the only groups that as a whole disapproved were atheists and agnostics. Shane,
Yeah.
how do you respond to this?
Ooh, well, we got some work to do. You know, that old Pogo cartoon that says we've met the enemy and it's us. But you know, but here's the thing is I have a little bit of patience to talk about this because I was one of those folks that made these same arguments. And I think it's easy, as Sister Helen said so well, to read the Bible in a certain way that justifies the death penalty. I think there's some versions of why Jesus died that have God kind of pointing a gun at humanity and deciding, you know, not to kill us and pointing the gun at Jesus and killing Jesus. And that you know, that may be a God that's easy to fear, but hard to love. And I think we've got to do better theology. And my, you know, understanding of Jesus is that Jesus is actually the Word made flesh. So now, I mean, that this is not just a word on paper, but this is what God is like. And Jesus becomes the lens through which we understand the Bible and which we we interpret Scripture. And when the Bible verses seem like they're in conflict with each other, Jesus is the referee, right? So that's why, you know, I think Jesus becomes so important in how we interpret our faith. But what breaks my heart is I learned, as Sister Helen said, you know, that you look at the rest of the world and there's only a handful of countries that are still actively executing people every year. The United States is always in the top 10 and usually in the top 5 top executing countries in the world. There's only a handful of states that are really championing the death penalty here in the United States. And as you look at those, it's the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt is the death belt. 95% of the executions are happening in the Bible Belt states. Now, it's also true that this is very connected to our history of race. And, you know, where lynchings were happening 100 years ago is where executions are happening today. The states that held on to slavery the longest are the same states that continue to hold on to the death penalty. But the Bible and Christianity has a massive role to play. And that's why, you know, when we looked at this Jesus in the electric chair, that wasn't just to be a stunning image. It was also a reminder that Tennessee, my home state, brought back the electric chair on Maundy Thursday, you know, right before Good Friday and Easter. And it's the latest reminder that we are really good at missing the whole point, right? And so I think that's where we've got to call people to really dig deeper on their faith. And we've got to look at some of those verses, like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, you know, that Jesus quotes. And he says, you've heard it said this, but I tell you this, you know. And so Jesus interrupted an execution and said, let the one who is without sin cast the first stone. So at the heart of this, it's so important that this is not just a political issue. This is a spiritual crisis. When Christians are the biggest defenders of the death penalty, that's a spiritual crisis, right? So that's why I think we've got to really address it as that. Now, one of the best statements on the death penalty, I'll have to say the Catholics are doing great on the statements, not always in practice, because Greg Abbott in Texas, the governor of Texas, is a Catholic. The governor in Tennessee is a Protestant, Governor Bill Lee. But the United Methodist statement is this, that capital punishment denies the power of Jesus to redeem, restore, and transform every human being. So I want to invite you to really, you know, those of you that are listening in to this really goes to the heart of our faith. Do we believe anybody's beyond redemption, even someone who we know has done something terribly violent or evil or committed murder. We got to believe that God's grace is bigger than our sins, and that
Yeah, but
God's
look,
love
let
is
me
bigger
tell you
than
how
our hate.
tricky that is, Shane.
Yeah,
So I can hear people saying, yeah, Jesus is going to redeem them. They sinned. They're going to die for their sin. And through that death, redemption is going to take place. They use the crucifixion of Jesus. I've actually heard a district attorney, Catholic district attorney in New Orleans say, death penalty is a temporary punishment.
yeah,
Well, the one you really got to be afraid of is God, who will throw you into eternal hell, the eternal punishment for your sins. And so by the death penalty, we help them have remorse for their sins, come to conversion, and so be saved. So you see how tricky that is?
Yes.
It's all very tricky. And you know what it brings us to is Word made flesh, Jesus made flesh, proximity.
Mhm.
I was hungry and he gave me to eat. I was gay. I was trans. I have been, scorned and mocked and prejudiced against and hurt. To translate Word made flesh into the hurting people of our society whose human rights are not being respected. How do you do that? How does somebody like me, who was in the suburbs most of my life, it's when you get in proximity and you begin to see, when I got into the St. Thomas Housing Project, I was like in another country. The way the police treated people was different. Kids who were going to the public schools and dropped out and came to get their GED had gone as far as juniors in a public school and could not read a third grade reader. People didn't have health care. People were forced to live in these housing projects because they didn't have a choice or the means to move to another place. Everything was different. And I awakened to it, and it also awakened me to the cushions and resources and the white privilege that I had.
Yeah.
That why did I go to such a good school? Why did I get a master's degree? Why did I? It was all resources. And it had a lot to do with white privilege. So when you wake up that you're really privileged and protected and cushioned, and you descend into the struggle, into the suffering of people, that's where the fire can happen. But it's very related to proximity.
Yeah.
Who are we among? Who do we have lunch with? Who do we talk to all the time? Who do we see? That's what we got to call ourselves to. And we're the ones, the privileged ones, who have to make the journey or the pilgrimage, or call it what you will, to move out of and into the places where the sufferings happen. That's why prison visitation and writing letters, have human contact with real prisoners.
Yeah.
And then when you have that relationship, and this is a Pope Francis thing, that thing of personal encounter, and that Christians need to be the field hospital, close to where the wounded are. That, all that's Word made flesh, where you can look into the suffering face of Christ, and then your own faith can be enkindled, and you begin, then all your energies then get ignited of, I got to put my life into this because I've been privileged.
Ooh.
And they are wrong. And we are just beginning in this country in a new way to deal with the legacy of slavery. The 1619 Project, and look at all the backlash against that now about critical race theory and all that we don't want our children to be uncomfortable with the story of slavery and all. It's not their fault. Let's move on kind of stuff. But we are deeply, deeply involved in this country with solving every problem through violence. And slavery, the whole country was, as the 1619 Project, the wealth of this country was built on the backs of slaves. And we cannot just dissociate ourselves from that. You really see it, of course, in the penal system. 75% of the people in Louisiana State Prison are, and 8 out of every 10 that are on death row, it's because they killed a white person. But when Black people are killed, negligible lives. So in opening up Jesus and in opening up our faith in the Word made flesh, we descend into all this real stuff going on in our society.
Amen.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is. You've both talked about how we interpret scripture. It starts with that, our theology, our understanding of how Jesus' ministry and life saved us and what that means. And then our experiences in our local community. It sounds from what you're both saying like the Bible Belt is our audience. And that touches me deeply because as I was sharing with you earlier, well, I didn't tell you the whole story. I'm a two-time Bible Belt native, Texas and Florida. Now that's a combination. Those are my two home states. And like you, Sister Helen, I grew in the church, but always with a personal understanding of salvation, the idea that Christianity had something to say about justice. I didn't stumble on that until really adulthood. So when we look at these 4 executions scheduled this month, they're all in the Bible Belt, right? We have 2 executions scheduled tomorrow. Could you tell us, Sister Helen, about those cases? We know they're both men over 70, relevant because international guidelines prohibit execution of people in this age range. They're both infirm. What do these cases say to you? And is there anything we can still do to advocate for them?
First of all, to wheel somebody up to kill them on a gurney, so what? When your mindset is that you have so identified people with their crime, and then you have that whole death penalty system in place with the politics that holds it up, people getting elected to office on it. He could be 89. He could be 99. I mean, they've had to escort people onto the gurney and lift them up because it doesn't matter to them. Once you have a mindset that you can kill a human being because you've identified them with their crime, none of this stuff matters. But where the work has to be done is to wake up the people. And religious communities, Methodists, Presbyterians, I've been dealing with this since I got involved in the 80s, all have these great statements, okay? But it's the Christians on the ground. So these cases, what you do when you do get involved is you get online and you use whatever is available to you, through the internet and signing petitions and putting calls into that governor's office all over the country, just saying, Governor, I don't live in Texas, or I don't live in, where's the other one? Tennessee? Is it Tennessee? Yeah. But I'm a Christian and you are too. And how can you, and just pepper them with phone calls and however you can get to them. That's what people can do to raise their voices.
The governor's mansion is where we need to be looking. We know there's another just heart-wrenching case, an execution scheduled for 1 week from today. Melissa Lucio, a Mexican-American mother of 14. Her case raises all kinds of concerns that really there does not seem to have even been a crime committed. Shane, can you start us off talking about her case? I know we want to really dive in and explore the issues it raises.
Sure. Sister Helen and I have both been real prayerful and active around this case and so many of them. I mean, that's why I think we got to fight for full abolition, because it's hard to battle, each case at a time. But Melissa Lucio is the latest case that reminds us how irreparably broken the system is. Here was a mother in Texas whose 2-year-old child had an accident, and her foot, Mariah's foot, her 2-year-old daughter's foot, was turned in, and she had fallen, had a pattern of falling. She fell down the steps. The family didn't think it was serious enough to have to take her to the hospital, so they were caring for her. But 2 days later, the little girl didn't wake up. They immediately called 911, and of course she passed away. And probably never even the thought crossed their mind that Melissa this wouldn't be treated as an accident, but as a criminal act. And after 5 hours of being interrogated by investigators, Melissa was also pregnant at this point when she was being interviewed. 100 times she asserted her innocence, that she didn't kill her daughter, and yet she was convicted and now is facing execution. And there's so many other things that have surfaced. I mean, there was
Yeah, but
evidence that's not even allowed in trial now that was
Right.
used. The prosecutor is actually the prosecuting attorney is in jail himself right now for 13 years for misconduct. So, Sister Helen, I don't know if you want to add anything, but I mean,
Oh,
it's
but
just
I do. I mean, in the exigencies of it, when she did try to do CPR, say a little bit about that on her child when she
yeah.
did the CPR.
Yeah,
Talk
so
about it.
well, you say more. I mean, I think what happened was they were doing everything that they knew to care for this little girl, and then what came up in court was that they accused her of beating the child, and we now know that the child had a physical illness too that made her skin look different, and so the evidence that was presented is now totally debunked evidence of bite marks that were so all of this is just to say that Sister Helen has said so many times that we're not killing the worst of the worst. We're killing the poorest of the poor. And what determines who actually gets executed in America is not the atrocity of the crime, but it's the resources of the defendant. So that's very clear in this case. So we're doing everything that we can to mobilize. The good news is this, y'all, is that folks in Texas have risen up, and proximity has made a huge difference. Jeff Leach, the chairman of the House of Representatives in Texas, a Republican legislator, took 6 other folks and they went to visit Melissa, and she prayed for them. And they talked about how life-changing this experience was to be with her. Incidentally, they were allowed to hug her, something that her own family has not been able to do. They don't allow contact visits. So it's just one more reminder, I think, of how urgent this is. I mean, we're days away from the execution right now, and everything that it's putting the family through. In the hearings, Sister Helen, I don't know if you saw this, but everybody's trying to pass on the responsibility. So they had the DA Science that was in these hearings, and they said, why don't you stop the execution? You have the power to do that. You know that she didn't do this. And he says, well, I'm waiting on the courts to do that, And so one of them said, there's another story about an innocent person being executed and everyone passing them around and wanting to wash their hands of the murder.
But
Talking about Jesus.
And here's the thing to help the people. By the way, when we tell these stories and bring people close to Melissa Lucio, this is a form of proximity. When you can open up a story to people, even though they're not physically there, it is the way we change things. It's the way human rights grew in the world. This woman, Lynn Hunt, wrote a book, The Invention of Human Rights. And it was like she started with the stories, the epistolary novels of women in the 18th century, where women, had no choice about marriage or whatever, and they married these old men and they suffered abuse. And the women told their stories, and men read those stories and wept and through a book, through a story, they could move into the connection, the interconnection between human beings, recognize the suffering of women, and it began to build the whole thing. And this is what we see here with the whole thing of the story of Melissa Lucio. But we gotta understand the death penalty system and how it works. Nobody is gonna die in a case, no matter how terrible the murder, if that DA, that prosecutor, does not seek death. And the way the death penalty has been constructed, when the Supreme Court put it back on 2 fault lines that we've really seen. One is supposed to be that the criterion is only the worst of the worst, only the most heinous, worst of the worst, as if we have a way of discerning the difference between what you call an ordinary murder or worst of the worst. So the criterion's off. Coupled with complete discretion of prosecutors to seek death or not. So is this an election year or not? All that enters into, and the truth is that wherever that is in the state, if it's with the Attorney General or the original DA, they do have the power to just stop fighting the appeal. They have that power, but they don't want to acknowledge that they have that power. So the system was set up in the beginning in a flawed way that was bound to fail. and it's why the death penalty is so broken, is you have an impossible criteria that is fuzzy beyond all belief. Let's call it heinous, let's call it whatever. Okay, you do a child, okay, you do a policeman, but not a fireman. But they killed my mother. They killed my mother. Sorry, it wasn't during a felony. I have to have these certain aggravated. It was impossible. And coupled with, the discretion of prosecutors. We have this attorney general in Arizona right now.
Yeah.
Who wants to kill everybody and get on death row before he leaves office, just like Trump did. How could Trump, with his attorney general Waymark, decide to kill 13 people before he left office and do it, even though for 17 years there'd been no federal executions, because he had the power. He had the discretionary power to kill people, and he did. And that's part of the brokenness of the system that we have to help people to understand. When it comes to this life on the line, like Melissa, all the direct action we can, but we got to also understand how the bloody thing is broken and always has been. And you come to this essential thing. You cannot entrust over to government. Right. You come right into human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's simply by being a human being. We have an inalienable right to life, which means it can't be alienated, can't be taken from us. Governments don't give human rights for good behavior, and they don't take them away for bad behavior. You can't let government be in charge. And that's the 1,500-year dialogue in the Catholic Church that finally paid off. Because in Catholic Church teaching, and I imagine in a lot of Christian churches, kept upholding that right of the state to take life. And you look at the history in that, before they had prisons. So what do you do with really violent, rabid people in the society? You got to give over the authority to people. And that was the thinking, to extinguish their life for the defense of society. That's for defense. This is a new argument that came in the modern death penalty in the United States, that there are some crimes by their nature. The only morally proportionate thing to do is to take their life. And I just saw that in full operation before a Judiciary Committee of Louisiana yesterday, where there's a repeal bill and they all voted against it. That moral proportion sense, only a death will be a death. And all this is part of people understanding the system, and that you can't, and just a little about the journey of the Catholic Church. When I got a chance, this pro-life thing, Shane, just like you were saying, pro-life, very narrow. And I said I had a chance to have a direct conversation with John Paul II. And I said, Your Holiness, I meet a lot of Catholics and they say they're pro-life. Well, when you talk to them, what they mean is, they're pro-innocent life. But when it comes to drawing that line where people have done a crime, well, no, they deserve what they get because of their crime. And I said, and then you have to descend into the humanness of the person who has done a crime, but they are worth far more than that. And that inviolable dignity as a human person. And the way I put it to the Pope was this. I brought him right inside the execution chamber with me. And I said, Your Holiness, when I'm walking with a man to execution, his legs are shackled, his hands are handcuffed close to a belt around his waist, can't move his hands. He's surrounded by 6 guards. We're going to walk about 30 paces together. And they're going to strap him in that wooden chair. And they're going to pump 1,900 volts of electricity through his body. We're about to walk. And he kind of turns to me, almost in a whisper, and says, Sister, please pray God holds up my legs while I make this walk. Where is the dignity in taking a human being and rendering them completely defenseless and deliberately killing them? That's in the Geneva Conventions. You can't do that against prisoners of war. Tie their hands behind their back, put them up against a fence and shoot them. What is it? It's the defenselessness in the person that makes it an act of torture and makes it so morally wrong. When we have the option to protect society without killing a person. And so finally in the Catholic Church, I was one part of the dialogue. I want to keep it in perspective. I didn't single-handedly do this, but when there's social change coming, there's a rise in consciousness and conscience in the people. It takes time. but people are good and they want to do the right thing. They just are so removed from what's going on. So we got to do that. We got to keep doing that to wake up people on that.
You gave us such a picture, Sister Helen. You were talking about how clear this is in the Universal Declaration. We all have an innate, inalienable, sacred right to life. And yet that principle hasn't penetrated here in our country sufficiently to lead us as a nation away from the death penalty. So we're still wrestling with it.
Big time, because it was not built into our Constitution. From the very beginning, things were skewed toward white people that had property. I mean, against women. I mean, slaves weren't considered persons. I mean, you know, dig into that 1619 project and just see how the reverberations of the way we laid the foundations, and that the wealth of the country was built on slave labor. And that's been with us. And so wealth has not been able to be inherited by Black people. So they're still in poverty. Why? I mean, and then prone to police brutality and all that. I mean, we got to dig into those societal reasons. We've always thought that we were this exceptional country, and, you know, but it was all built on things that were really, really wrong. We are skewed. We are very, very, very imperfect. And to recognize that, and because what spurs us to action? What spurs us to go, wait, I got to get involved in that? It's when our hearts, when we're brought close, we see suffering, we recognize the pattern of the injustice, and then we join with other people to work to change. And that is the living of hope.
Yep.
You were talking about race and gender, and it just struck me that Melissa Lucio's case of poverty raises all these issues. And I wanted to mention, for anyone who doesn't know, there is a documentary film on her case, The State of Texas versus Melissa, that's out there, I think on Amazon and Hulu. For folks who aren't up to speed. And it's searing to see how so many of the issues you've mentioned, Sister Helen, the abuse, that history of abuse that Melissa suffered, she just being up against a system that gave her no regard and no respect at any stage. Is there anything we can all be doing now on her case or any of the other cases we've mentioned? Do you have calls to action that you'd want to give to the folks listening? Shane, do you want to start us off on this?
Yeah, take it, Shane.
Well, so folks can go to, I put a website in the chat, it's freemelissalucio.org, and people can also go to our website, deathpenaltyaction.org. There's petitions, there's phone numbers, certainly the governor, the DA's office, all of those phone calls matter, especially when it's people of faith that are friendly and respectful, but also very convicted and adamant about stopping this execution. And just to give us a glimpse of hope too, is that the United States has evolved in how we practice the death penalty, even though we've got a long way to go. You know, we had the Salem witch trials, like we had all kinds of things that used to be death-worthy crimes. And even when it comes to race, the first formerly Confederate state, Virginia, abolished the death penalty last year. And there's an uprising of young people. There's a racial reckoning happening in our country. So things are changing, and I'm hopeful. 80% of millennial Christians born after 1980, are against the death penalty, 80%. So the opposition to the death penalty is the highest it's been in a generation. Even in Texas, new death sentences are the lowest they've been. Executions are dropping. Every one is too many. But I want you to feel the hope, you know. And one of the other studies that was interesting was, Sister Helen, I don't know if you saw this one, but Pew asked Americans, do you believe that Jesus would be in favor of the death penalty? 95% of Americans said, no, he was a victim of the death penalty. We just got to convince the Christians. that this matters. So we got to do this work, y'all. And I want to invite you to pull out your faith and not be, not be discriminate. Put it out there. I mean, this is what it's about. It's about love and redemption. So we can be hopeful. I think that we could be the generation to abolish the death penalty because of the great work. We're walking in the shoes of folks like Sister Helen. But we're going to look back at this like we look back at slavery, with horror and shame, and trying to explain to our children and grandchildren how Christians use the Bible to defend this horrific practice. And so it didn't take, courage to say slavery is wrong, a generation later. It took courage when slavery was acceptable to many people and still being defended by many Christians. And that's the same way with the death penalty right now. This is a moment where we need to have courage and we need to raise our voices up, because one of the real questions will be, what role did the church play? What role did Christians play in making history when it comes to the abolition of the death penalty? And I hope we've got some things that we can say we played a role in this.
And also back to the Bible, because I saw that we had a question from one of our viewers. We were talking earlier about how to interpret the Bible, how to understand what Christian faith says. And Lillian asks, at the end, what is Jesus' message? In other words, what would you say to Christians who are for the death penalty? Can you give us kind of the simple breakdown if someone is taking a literal kind of, well, we see this penalty in the Bible, or we see eye for an eye? How do you meet someone in that conversation, Sister Helen?
Well, I mean, start digging into the gospel stories of Jesus. When, according to the law, a woman caught in adultery is supposed to be stoned. There you go. Put the equivalent on. Here's the worst of the worst. Here's the law. And how did he respond? I mean, and why then did he say, go and learn what this means? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And I just finished writing a new preface for this book, Jesus Before Christianity, by Robert Nolan. And, you had the upholders of the law, you had the temple leaders who, the purification rituals, this is what you do to be a pure Jew, to be holy enough to come in the temple, all those laws and prescriptions. And Jesus talked about the heart, about the purity of heart. And in this book, very interesting, Albert Nolan traces the decisions made in his life. So we know he was baptized by John the Baptist. And the easiest career choice in the world would have been, when John the Baptist is killed by Herod, for Jesus to step in that river and to keep baptizing people for repentance, renewal of life. And he didn't do that. What did he do? And then Nolan traces, he went and lived among the marginated, and there were so many ways to be outcast and marginated. And if you were a leper, you had to live on the outskirts. If you were a sinner, people thought that if you were sick, you had sinned, your parents, your grandparents had sinned. There were so many ways. And he goes among them and he touches lepers and he hugs children, and compassion drove him. But of course, proximity. He was among them. And he gave us the final, exam for all of us. When did I see you hungry? When did I see you thirsty? When did I see you as a trans person who was prejudiced against and violated? When did I see you? When? And that's the Jesus of compassion, who moved and invited people in to dine with him that were called the sinners and the outcasts. And I think the call to us is that we, especially we who are so privileged, need to move among those people, but you cannot do it alone. This is a call to join with a community of people who are working for justice. This is a one-shot deal to do a thing like this. Maybe you're inspired, but it's what we're going to do afterwards. And we got to join with a community of people who are connecting their faith to justice. If we don't do that, you can be inspired for a while. You might even sign a little petition or two. Then you're going to fade. You got to be part of a community for this to last. That's my thing. Shane, what do you want to say?
That's a good word. That's a good word. Well, just to pick up on that. Go ahead, Allison. Yeah.
I was just going to say, tell us about eye for an eye. I've read some of what you've written on kind of how to respond to this logic.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is actually one of the most well-known Bible verses to everybody, Christian, non-Christian, whatever. And it's one of the most misused. And I went back and kind of dug into that. A lot of scholars have looked at it, but basically it is an ancient way of thinking about justice as allowing for reciprocal harm. So one way of thinking about justice was that you could harm someone back in the same way that they had harmed you, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But what we've done, it's in the ancient law was called lex talionis. It's where we get the idea of retaliation from, right? But what's so important is that it was meant to be a limit, to stop the spiral and the cycle of violence. Because we know how it all works. You know, someone knocks your tooth out, you're going to knock their whole mouth out and blacken their eye, and it just keeps going, right? So it was meant to limit that retaliatory justice. Now we've used what was meant to be a limit as a license, an open license for revenge. And that's why Jesus shines so brightly, because he knows how well known this was. And he says, you've heard it said, Moses told you this, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you this. And Jesus is, I think, you know, this is consistent with my theology, is the fulfillment of the law. He's not abolishing it, but showing us what perfect love looks like, right? So you don't even have to return harm for harm. Even though you can, doesn't mean you should. As my mama said, 2 wrongs don't make a right, right? So it doesn't make sense for us to hurt them back. And we know that, right, Allison? Deep down, like if Sister Helen poked my eye out, not many of us are going to say that the best justice we can do is to gouge her eye out. You know, we're not going to cut someone's arm off. We don't rape people who rape.
Shane, can I get in here?
Yeah.
Look, can I get in here? The big thing, and it's every spiritual teacher, is that we have to get past individual hurt and just falling into, I'm going to do to you what you did to me. Turning hate for hate and hurt for hurt. Love your enemies. Why? I mean, you know, think, oh, that's so impossible. But we have to hold up the people we have met that do this. I'll hold up Lloyd LeBlanc from Deme Walking, whose son David, his only son, was killed. And he shares his journey with me. We'd go and pray together. He's the story. Lloyd LeBlanc's son David was killed. And he begins in that place of anger. He begins in that place of, I want to kill the ones who kill my son with my own bare hands. But he notices what is happening to him, and he keeps praying. I know this isn't where Jesus wants me to be, but what could he do with those human feelings? But then he noticed that it was consuming him, that he was angry all the time. And he's telling me, Sister Helen, I'm a kind man. I love to help people, but I'm losing it. I'm losing it. And at one point he held up his hand like this. And then he just said, and then I said, They killed my boy, but I'm not going to let them kill me. I'm going to do what Jesus said. If you even look at the word forgiveness, it means to give before. It means that the love inside us remains intact by the grace of God and also by the love of community, that we don't let the hatred overcome us so that then we become the hater wanting to do. And that's why it's so unfair to promise victims' families that what we're going to do for you, and the average wait is 15 years. What we're going to do for you now is that we can allow you to sit on the front row as we kill the one who killed your loved one, and that's going to heal you. That is so bankrupt. That is so false. But what does it mean to have enough love inside of us intact that we can give over the hatred over and not live out of it? That's true transformation in grace. And the Lloyd LeBlancs and the victims' families who have suffered are the ones that we hold up to show in the flesh, the word made flesh. Here's how it's done. Here's an ordinary man who lived it out in his life, and we hold them up because we need the saints among us. We need the example of people who live it. And I want to throw
Yeah.
that to the
Oh,
discussion.
that's Allison. I think that's such an important word, and Sister Helen has said that over and over and over. And it's so important for everybody to hear today that to be against the death penalty is not to be against justice or to
Mhm.
say that murder shouldn't have consequences, but it's insisting that violence is the problem, not the cure. Killing is the is the problem, not the solution. And the death penalty just mirrors that evil that we're trying to heal the world of, so we can do justice. And it's those heroes like Bill Pelkey, Sharon
Yeah.
Risher, whose mother was killed by Dylan Roof and Emmanuel AME, and she was so angry, and she should be. She's unapologetically angry, but she said, "But I knew forgiveness was the only way forward, not just so he could sleep at night, but so that I could sleep at night." Because
Yeah, no,
hatred,
that's
it
right.
does something to us.
It's
So
like that. It's like that Native American proverb: "The one who seeks the journey of revenge should first dig 2 graves."
mm,
And then
mm,
I've also heard it said it's like you take poison and you live on this
yeah,
poison and you hope it kills the other one. I mean, these are easy things for us to say. The ones who really help victims, families, or other victims who have been through the struggle. That's really, I was just with somebody the other day who said, the first time I heard other people that also were victims and had somebody murdered, then they need the community, and we need to help form those. We need to do real work in this, not just getting rid of the death penalty, but real healing help for those who have been violated, who've lost loved ones. That's the other part of our work.
that's
Wow.
right. And I'll put this in the link, but groups like Journey of Hope, from Violence to Healing, or there's so many different groups that are made up of murder victims, family members that are some
And
of the
those
most
that have
credible.
people on death row.
That's
And
right. Yep. Together
Right.
saying violence is the problem. Yeah.
Spiritual transformation for everyone involved. And I hear you both saying that turning away from violence, we're called to turn in Christian tradition, turning away from violence is something that's going to be healing and transformative for everyone affected by these tragedies. We have a lot of great feedback, a lot of people interested in this conversation. Let me mention it will be freely available online. I think it's right now on Justice Revival's Facebook page, and it will also be on our website, justicerevival.org, and we'll share with our wonderful guests, Sister Helen Prejean and Shane Claiborne. Before we close out, I want to invite you, if there's any last call to action or way people can join you or support your work, would you like to let people know how to get together with you? Sister Helen?
Oh, yeah, well, sure. For Catholics out there, or even if you're not Catholics, we have the Catholic Mobilizing Network and its job is, now we have the change in the teaching of the Catholic Church, and it's on the books, it's in the catechism. But that's a document, that's words in a document. You got to mobilize people. Catholic Mobilizing Network does the job. And the key thing to help people understand, it's when we say we're pro-life and we mean innocent life, it's a much harder journey spiritually to get to the place where you start with outrage at what a crime and the suffering of a person, and to get to the place where you can recognize that person has a dignity. That's a hard journey. And Catholic Mobilizing Network helps people do that from the whole point of view of their Catholic faith and plunging into Jesus and the whole bit. So I would mention them as an action group for people to join.
Great.
Yeah.
Shane, how about you?
Yeah, I put our redletterchristians.org. We get our names from the Bibles that have the words of Jesus in red. So we're like old Gandhi when he was asked about Christianity, and he said, "I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians acted more like him." So that's what we're after. We would love for you to join us. And I was just looking at my desk here, Sister Helen, and I want the last invitation I would say is, let's all make a step to keep leaning in to the pain and the struggle, and to make this proximity thing real. I was just writing Sister Helen, John Ramirez, who's facing execution in Texas, and I was telling him I'd send him some books or whatever he wants, prayer books or whatever. And he wrote me back, and I'm thinking through, like, what would I want to read if my execution is kind of imminent? And he said, well, actually, the prayer books are great, but I got plenty of them. I've been making origami, and I keep this on my desk. And he says, and so send me some craft books. And I just want to leave that with you, that this is what we're talking about, right? People made in the image of God, whose lives are at stake. And so we can deal with the violence that humans are capable of without doing more violence. So let's keep being champions of life without
That's
exception.
good. That's
Thank you,
good.
Sister
Join a
Helen, for your
community.
witness.
Join a community.
Yeah, that's
Join
right.
a community.
That's a good word. And I'll offer one other call to action. I just learned that Death Penalty Action has a national day of action this Saturday, April 23rd, to free Melissa Lucio. There are activities happening in a number of states across the country. So please check that out. Please, if you've been moved or inspired, support these amazing advocates, Shane Claiborne and Sister Helen Prejean. They are giving their lives to do really crucial work, to do God's work. I know they also have bills to pay. So if the Spirit moves you, support their work with your time, your talents, your treasures in any way you can. And I want to thank our guests and thank everyone who's been here with us today. And know that at Justice Revival, we want to stand with you and keep standing in solidarity to champion this movement, this growing movement to abolish the death penalty and to turn from violence.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Shane.
Yeah.
This was a great conversation.
You too. Bless y'all both. Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.